There is a county in Florida where every major insurance company has walked away. Not reduced coverage, not raised rates, walked. The last carrier filed its exit paperwork on a Tuesday morning in early 2025, and by the end of that week, 41,000 homeowners opened their mailboxes to find a single sheet of paper telling them their policies would not renew. Not next year, not in 90 days, in 30. And the paper did not explain why, because the math had already explained it to the underwriters, and the underwriters had explained it to the regulators, and nobody wanted to say the words out loud. The words were simple: this county is no longer insurable, which is another way of saying this county is no longer financeable, which is another way of saying this county is no longer ownable, which is another way of saying this county has, quietly, on a Tuesday, stopped being part of the American economy in the way the American economy has been understood for 70 years. I am Report State, and for 20 weeks across this first season, I have been walking you through the slow, grinding reorganization of this country. We covered exodus, we covered climate migration, we covered infrastructure on borrowed time, we covered the insurance market quietly pulling up its stakes in 4 southern states. We covered the retirement crisis eating through suburbs that were supposed to be the finish line. And if you watched carefully, you noticed something. There was one state that kept showing up. Episode 4, Episode 7, Episode 9, Episode 11, Episode 13, Episode 15, Episode 16, Episode 17, Episode 18. 9 times out of 19, before this finale, one state kept appearing as a data point, as a case study, as a footnote that would not stay in its footnote. That state was Florida, and there is a reason. The reason is that Florida is not a state anymore. Florida is a compression. It is every trend of this decade, running at the same time, in the same geography, on the same households. Exodus and arrival, layered. Climate and real estate, layered. Insurance collapse and property tax inflation, layered. Retirement boom and retirement breakdown, layered. You can look at California for the exodus story. You can look at Michigan for the infrastructure story. You can look at West Virginia for the retirement story. But if you want to see all of them at once, pressing on the same people, in the same week, in the same county, you look at Florida. Which is why this finale is not a list of states. It is one state. 10 counties inside one state. Because if you want to see America in 2030, you do not need a time machine. You need a rental car and a week. Florida lost 270,000 residents to outmigration last year. That is the first time that number has gone negative since 2005. Think about that. Florida, the state that has been the destination of American retirement, the destination of American tax flight, the destination of American climate denial and remote work, the state that grew through every recession of the last 20 years. That Florida lost residents, and they did not leave because they got bored. They left because the math stopped working. The insurance market logged 11 insolvencies in a single calendar year. Property taxes in certain counties climbed 34% in 2 years, not because the millage rate changed, but because the assessed values did before the storms, and now the premiums did after. And the Miami-Dade sea level rise projections, the ones the city used to commission quietly and publish with small disclaimers, are now printed on federal flood maps that mortgage underwriters are required to read. So here is what we are going to do. 10 counties, ranked number 10 to number 1. Each one a story about a different part of the reorganization. One county where insurance has functionally disappeared. One county where the median age just hit 68 and is climbing. One county where the coastline retreated so fast, the local government had to move the fire station twice. One county, number 1, that became the first in the United States to formally request federal relocation funding for its residents. Not storm aid, not rebuilding grants, relocation, meaning the county government filed paperwork that said, "We would like the federal government to pay to move our people somewhere else." That request is sitting on a desk in Washington right now, and almost nobody outside Florida knows it exists. If you want to understand America in 2030, subscribe. Not for me, for you. Because whatever is happening in these 10 counties is coming for a coastal county near you, or a desert county near you, or a wildfire county near you, within the next 6 years. The only question is whether you see it coming or whether it shows up in your mailbox on a Tuesday morning. Like the report State Investigation. Share this with someone who thinks Florida is just a punchline. They are in for a story. Let's break it down. Number 10, Lee County, the insurance graveyard. Lee County sits on Florida's southwest coast, wrapping around Fort Myers and Cape Coral. Population just under 800,000. It is the county that, before the pandemic, was one of the fastest growing real estate markets in the entire country. Builders could not put up houses fast enough. Retirees from Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and Indiana were arriving in U-Hauls every week. And then, in late 2022, a storm that hydrologists had been warning about for a decade arrived. After the storm, 17 insurance companies filed paperwork to stop writing new policies in Lee County. 11 of them filed for full insolvency within the next 18 months. The state's insurer of last resort, which was designed as a backstop for a few thousand hard-to-place properties, ended up with over 220,000 policies in this one county alone. The average annual premium on a Lee County home went from about $2,400 in 2021 to just over $9,000 by late 2025. That is not a rate hike, that is a different product. 30% of homeowners in Cape Coral now carry what the industry calls ghost coverage, which is a wind and flood exclusion policy that technically satisfies a mortgage requirement but pays out almost nothing when the water comes. Realtors in Fort Myers told me, off the record, that they now spend more time on the phone with insurance underwriters than with buyers. There is a Reddit thread from a Lee County homeowner named Marcus Halloran. He bought a 3-bedroom in Cape Coral in 2020 for $310,000. He wrote that his insurance in 2021 was $2,100 a year. Inhented a countdown. The comedic part, if there is one, is that the welcome signs on Interstate 75 at the Lee County line still advertise the Florida lifestyle. Warm beaches, low taxes, friendly people. They do not mention that the property tax on Marcus Halloran's house went up 31% in 2 years because the assessed value climbed with the rebuilding costs, and the insurance climbed with the risk model, and his retirement income from a state pension in Ohio did not climb at all. Picture this. Marcus standing in his driveway on a Sunday morning in November, coffee in his hand, watching a moving truck at his neighbor's house. The neighbor is leaving. The neighbor paid $300,000 for that house 4 years ago, and he is selling it for $210,000 now, and he is still considering himself lucky because he is getting out before the next hurricane season revises the math again. Marcus takes a sip of his coffee and does not say anything. There is nothing to say. Lee County is number 10 because it is the simplest version of the story. Insurance left, prices fell, people followed. If you think Lee is bad, wait until you see what happened 1 county south, where the money was supposed to be bulletproof. Number 9, Collier County, the gated retreat that can't retreat. Collier County is Naples. Naples is old money. Naples is the kind of place where the average single-family home price is just under $1,400,000. Naples is the kind of place where homeowners do not worry about insurance premiums in the ordinary sense, because they self-insure, or they pay cash, or they carry umbrella policies through private market syndicates that sound more like estate planning instruments than home coverage. Collier County is the Florida that was supposed to be immune, gated, landscaped, generationally funded, hurricane-proof in the accountant's sense, even if not in the engineer's sense. And by every reasonable expectation, Collier County should have been the one county in this finale where the math still worked. It isn't. Here is what happened. After 2022, the private wealth syndicates that insured the most expensive coastal properties in Naples began what they called portfolio rebalancing. In plain English, they stopped writing new policies on waterfront properties and began non-renewing existing ones. Not because the premiums were unpayable, the premiums were always payable, because the total accumulated risk exposure in a single geographic mile of coastline had exceeded what their reinsurance backstop would tolerate. These syndicates had been the quiet plumbing under Naples's real estate economy for decades. When they pulled back, a $4 million beachfront home in Port Royal could not find primary coverage at any price. The owners began doing what rich owners do. They started paying cash for risk. They put $800,000 in a segregated escrow account against future storm damage. They hired private hurricane engineers to retrofit their walls. And they put their houses on the market quietly, through pocket listings, without MLS entries, because a public listing at a reduced price would have moved the comps for the entire block. Property values in Port Royal and Old Naples are down between 11% and 17% from their 2022 peaks. That does not sound dramatic, until you convert it to dollars. A house that was listed at $7 million is now sitting unsold at $5.8 million. The owner is not desperate, but the owner is also not replacing anyone, because the next generation of wealthy buyers, the ones who used to treat a Naples beachfront as a status purchase, are looking at the insurance situation and the sea level rise model and buying in Charleston or Savannah, or more often in Asheville, North Carolina, 600 miles inland at elevation in what their wealth managers now call climate premium real estate. The median age in Collier County is 64. The registered voter rolls show a net decline of about 3,800 residents year over year. These are small numbers. Naples is a small place, but the direction has reversed. For 40 years, the direction was one way, into Naples. Now, for the first time since anyone counted, it is the other direction. A Reddit user named Diane Okafor, who lived in a waterfront condo in Naples for 19 years, posted a long thread explaining why she sold. She wrote that her HOA special assessment for seawall reinforcement in 2024 came in at $47,000 per unit. She wrote that the condo board voted to do it anyway, because they were told the alternative was losing their master policy. She wrote that she paid it, and then she wrote that 8 months later, the master policy was non-renewed anyway, and the board sent out another special assessment, this one for $81,000, and that was the one that broke her. She sold her condo for less than she paid for it in 2004 and moved to Greenville, South Carolina. Picture this. A Sunday afternoon in Old Naples. The houses are still beautiful. The lawns are still perfect. The cars in the driveways are still expensive. But 1 out of every 5 houses on a given block has a quiet listing that nobody mentions at the club. The tennis courts are half empty. The restaurant that used to take reservations 6 weeks out is taking them next Tuesday. The money did not run out. The math did. If Collier County, the wealthiest coastal county in Florida, cannot self-insure its way through this decade, what do you think happens to the counties that were never wealthy enough to try? Let's find out. Number 8. Palm Beach County, the billionaire hedge. Palm Beach County is a strange place on a map. On the east side, you have Palm Beach itself, which is the richest zip code in the state, home to former presidents, hedge fund billionaires, and art collectors, who buy houses they never intend to live in. On the west side, you have small inland farming and working-class communities that have been absorbed into the county's footprint, but have almost nothing in common with the coast. And in the middle, you have West Palm Beach, which, over the last 5 years, has tried very publicly to reinvent itself as a kind of Miami Light, a lower tax, lower traffic alternative for financial firms fleeing New York. That is the version of Palm Beach that shows up in glossy magazines. The version that does not show up is what the billionaires are actually doing with their houses. I want you to understand this clearly because it is one of the most telling data points in the entire season. In the last 36 months, private wealth managers serving clients in Palm Beach have quietly added a new standard line item to their real estate portfolios. It is called a climate exit hedge. The function of a climate exit hedge is to pre-purchase high-elevation real estate in inland regions, usually in North Carolina, Tennessee, or upstate New York, which the client has no intention of ever moving to, for the purpose of owning a habitable and insurable structure in case the Florida property becomes functionally unsellable within 10 years. It is not a vacation home, it is a life raft. And the amount of money flowing into these climate exit hedges, according to one wealth advisor I spoke to who asked not to be named, is now in the low billions annually, just from Palm Beach and Miami-Dade clients combined. Think about what that means. The people with the most information, the most money, and the most direct access to private climate modeling, the people who would be the very last to panic in any ordinary scenario, are, quietly, on their accountant's advice, buying escape routes. They are not selling Palm Beach yet, but they are also no longer all in on Palm Beach. And when the people at the top of the information curve start hedging, the question is not whether the broader market will follow. The question is how long the lag is. The median home price in Palm Beach itself is now just over $6 million. The median age has climbed to 59, up from 52 a decade ago, which tells you the county is aging in place faster than it is bringing in younger buyers. Property tax revenue is still rising, but almost entirely because of reassessment, not because of new construction. New single-family permits in the unincorporated parts of the county are down 61% from their 2020 peak. Builders are not betting on this place, because the sophisticated money isn't either. A Reddit thread from a Palm Beach realtor, Brian Levine, got a lot of attention a few months ago. He wrote that he had, in a single week, fielded calls from 3 different clients asking the same question. Not, how much can I sell for? Rather, how long can I wait before selling? The question assumes the direction is down. The question is only about timing. Brian wrote, and I quote, "I have been in real estate in this county for 22 years, and I have never had a client ask me how long I have before I lose value. Always, how much can I make? That is a different business now." Picture this, a Friday evening on Worth Avenue. The shops are lit up. The valets are parking Bentleys. The restaurants are full. To anyone walking down that street, it looks exactly like Palm Beach has looked for 40 years. But in the offices above those shops, wealth advisors are having quiet meetings with clients about a different kind of diversification. In the parking garages, some of those Bentleys will be listed for sale by spring. In the mansions behind the hedges, half the staff has already been told that the house will be closed 9 months out of the year, starting next winter. Nobody will announce anything. That is not how Palm Beach works. But the money is moving, and when the money moves, the rest of the county eventually notices. Palm Beach is number 8, not because the collapse is visible yet, but because the hedge is. The people at the top have already made their peace with the next 10 years. They just have not told the people at the bottom. Number 7. Broward County, the flood accountants. Broward County is Fort Lauderdale. Broward County is just north of Miami-Dade. Broward County has a population of 2 million, which makes it one of the most densely populated counties in the state, and it is also one of the flattest. The average elevation in Broward is roughly 6 feet above sea level. You read that correctly, 6 feet, not a typo. The entire county, the second most populous in Florida, sits at an elevation that, under current mid-range projections from federal climate modeling, will see regular nuisance flooding on 90 days per year by 2035. 90 days, meaning 1 out of every 4 days of the year, some part of Broward County will have standing water on the streets at high tide, regardless of whether it rained, regardless of whether there was a storm, regardless of anything except the tide calendar. This is already happening. Broward County has what it calls sunny day flooding. The phrase is in the official county planning documents. Sunny day flooding is when the sun is out, the sky is clear, no rain has fallen in days, and the streets are underwater because the tide came in, and the storm drains in this part of the country do not drain uphill. The county has spent, over the last 6 years, just over $1.4 billion on raised roads, upgraded pumps, and seawall reinforcement. That sounds like a lot of money until you read the engineering studies, which estimate that to meaningfully hold back the projected 2040 flood levels, Broward would need to spend, conservatively, $11 to $14 billion. The county budget cannot support that. The state budget will not support that. And the federal government, through FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers, has signaled through policy papers that the era of subsidized coastal armoring in low-elevation counties is nearing its end. What has emerged in Broward is a profession that did not meaningfully exist 5 years ago: flood accountants. These are specialized property advisors who analyze a Broward home purchase not by square footage or school district, but by expected uninsurable days per year over the 30-year life of a mortgage. A flood accountant will walk into your prospective living room, pull out a laptop, show you a tide chart overlaid on a LiDAR elevation map of your street, and tell you that this house will, on current trajectory, be inaccessible by car on approximately 240 days out of the remaining 30 years of your mortgage, and that the mortgage itself assumes it will be accessible on all of them. Then they charge you $600 and hand you a recommendation: buy, wait, or walk. Most of their recommendations are walk. A Reddit user named Teresa Moreau, who lives in Hollywood, Florida, posted a photo last year of her driveway at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. No storm, no rain, blue sky. Her car was parked in 8 inches of salt water. She wrote that her block floods on king tides 4 to 6 times a year now. In 2010, her block had never flooded. She wrote that she has started keeping rubber boots by her front door, the way people in the Midwest keep snow shovels in the garage. The comment that stuck with me was from another user who replied, "You know your neighborhood is finished when the infrastructure becomes seasonal." Property values in Broward are still technically holding, but the composition of buyers has shifted. Investors, meaning cash buyers, meaning people who intend to rent the property short-term until the math breaks and then walk, now make up 39% of purchases in coastal Broward. Owner-occupants, meaning families, meaning the kind of buyer that actually builds a community, are down to around 40%. The rest are LLCs of various configurations, often traced back to parent companies in states with no income tax and no requirement to disclose ultimate ownership. What this means, in human terms, is that large portions of coastal Broward are no longer being bought by people who plan to live there. They are being bought by financial vehicles that plan to extract income until the asset becomes uninsurable, and then transfer the loss to whoever is holding the bag. Picture this: a weekday morning in Hollywood or Dania Beach. The streets are being used like streets. Kids waiting for the bus, a mail carrier on her rounds, a dog walker, and on the next block over, a crew from the county is sandbagging a storm drain. Not because a storm is coming, because the tide chart said so. The mail carrier steps around the puddle without looking at it. Everyone here has learned to walk around the water without seeing it. That is what acclimatization looks like. It is not acceptance, it is exhaustion. Broward is number 7 because it still functions, but it functions on a schedule that no one signed up for. Number 6, Miami-Dade North, the vertical bet. Most people, when they hear Miami-Dade, think of the coastline, the beaches, the ports, the cruise terminals. But Miami-Dade County is vast, and there is a version of it that almost never gets photographed. The inland north, the area around Doral, Hialeah, Miami Gardens, and the unincorporated stretches that run up toward the Broward line. This is where a very specific bet is being made right now, and it is one of the most interesting bets in American real estate. The bet is vertical. Here is the logic. Developers and long-range capital allocators have looked at the Miami-Dade elevation map. They have noticed that while the coast is at 3 feet, certain inland ridges in the north of the county sit at 12, 14, in a few places 16 feet above sea level. That is not high, but in a county where every foot matters, 14 feet is the difference between being flood zone A and not being mapped at all. So over the last 4 years, an enormous wave of mid-rise and high-rise residential construction has been concentrated specifically in these inland, slightly elevated corridors. You can drive from the coast inland and watch it happen. The closer you get to the water, the older the housing stock. The further inland, the newer and the taller. They are building up on the highest ground the county has, because that is the only ground the next 30 years of mortgage underwriting will still bless. This would look like a smart pivot, except for 3 problems. The first problem is infrastructure. The water, sewer, and road systems in inland Miami-Dade were built for single-family suburban density. They were not built for 30-story towers. The county is scrambling to catch up, but pipes that were installed in 1970 cannot carry the load of a 2025 population, and you cannot replace them without digging up every street in the corridor, which nobody wants to pay for. The second problem is schools. The school district in inland Miami-Dade is already at 118% of capacity in certain zones. New residential towers bring new families, and the schools cannot absorb them, which means the new towers end up populated disproportionately by investor units, short-term rentals, and younger professionals without children, which hollows out the civic fabric the developers claimed they were building. The third problem is the assumption itself. 14 feet of elevation sounds like a margin, but it is not, because when a major storm surge event arrives, it does not stop at the 3-foot elevation line. It pushes inland. The engineering reports from the State Emergency Management Office project that in a severe surge scenario, parts of the inland corridor that the developers marketed as safe will see 4 to 7 feet of water, which would put new 20-story towers with flooded garages, flooded lobbies, flooded first 3 floors of mechanical and electrical infrastructure, and 18 floors of residents marooned above a dead building. The insurance industry has noticed. Commercial policies on the new inland towers are now being written with exclusions for what the industry calls cascading infrastructure failure, which is a polite term for what happens when the building is technically intact, but the elevators do not work, the water does not run, the sewage has no outlet, and the electrical vaults are underwater. Under those exclusions, the building is uninhabitable and uninsured for the uninhabitability itself. That is a gap the developers do not advertise. A Reddit post from a new buyer in a Doral high-rise. A user named Rafael Cantu, who bought a 2-bedroom unit in 2023, wrote that his HOA recently disclosed that the building's master insurance now excludes flood-related business interruption, which means if the building becomes uninhabitable for any flood-driven reason, the HOA is not covered for the cost of relocating residents, and neither are the residents. He wrote, I bought a unit, not a bunker, and somehow I ended up with the worst features of both. The comment under his post that got the most upvotes said, "Welcome to vertical Florida, where the views are great until the ground floor dies." Picture this, a brand new 28-story tower in Doral on a sunny afternoon, glass gleaming, pool on the roof, young couples moving in with cardboard boxes. Everything looks pristine, everything looks like progress. And 3 streets over, a 1975 ranch house with a cracked driveway sits in a neighborhood that during the last king tide had water in the front yards for 11 hours. Both of them are in Miami-Dade North. Both of them are inland. Both of them are betting on the same ground. Only one of them has admitted to the bet. Miami-Dade North is number 6 because it is where capital is still pretending the story has a happy ending. The tower is the optimism. The ranch house is the reality. When the two collide, the tower wins the press release and the ranch house wins the forecast. We are about to find out whose math was right. Number 5, Volusia County, the Forgotten Coast. If you drive north on Interstate 95 past Cocoa Beach, past the Kennedy Space Center, past the stretch where the tourists thin out and the billboards get older, you enter Volusia County. Volusia is Daytona Beach. Volusia is Deltona. Volusia is the part of Florida that used to be working-class tourism, racing fans, bikers in October, spring breakers in March, retirees on fixed incomes year-round. Volusia is the county that almost no national housing narrative talks about, because it is not glamorous enough for the collapse stories and not expensive enough for the bubble stories. It just sits there, quietly, absorbing the impacts that the more famous counties are generating. Here is what is happening in Volusia. The county lost about 14,000 residents to outmigration last year. That number is small compared to Miami-Dade, but relative to Volusia's population, it is meaningful. The average home price is about $330,000, which 5 years ago would have looked cheap. In 2025, that is a house that eats a $3,100 monthly mortgage payment, a $4,000 annual property tax bill, and an insurance premium that, depending on which part of the county, runs between $3,800 and $7,200. The average household income in Volusia County is $61,000. Do the arithmetic. The math is already broken for most buyers, and the people who got in before the pandemic and locked in 3% mortgages are sitting on a combination of equity and exit anxiety. They do not want to sell because they cannot replace the mortgage. They do not want to stay because the carrying costs keep climbing. So they are stuck. The technical real estate term for this is a transaction freeze. The human term is paralysis. The coastline in Volusia has been losing beach for decades, but the rate accelerated after 2022. In some segments of New Smyrna Beach and Daytona, the high tide line has moved 50 to 70 feet inland from where it sat 20 years ago. The beachfront condominiums that were built in the 70s and 80s on what was then a deep beach now sit, in some cases, with their pool decks 30 feet from the water. Local governments have spent millions on emergency sand replacement, but the sand is imported. The sand is expensive. The sand does not stay, and the Federal Army Corps of Engineers has quietly reduced its participation in beach renourishment programs along this stretch because the cost-benefit ratio no longer favors the investment. The fire department in one Volusia beach town has relocated twice in 8 years. The first relocation was because the original station, built in 1968, was flooding during ordinary storm events. The second relocation was because the replacement station, built in 1996 on what engineers then considered safe ground, began flooding during king tides by 2023. The current station sits 3 blocks inland on the highest parcel the city could acquire, and the city manager told a local reporter that she gives it 15 years. That phrase, "I give it 15 years," is something you hear a lot in Volusia. Not in a panicked way, but in a resigned way. The way people in an old industrial town might talk about the factory. A Reddit user, Cynthia Boyle, who has lived in Ormond Beach for 27 years, wrote a thread last year about what she called the slow drain. She described watching her neighborhood change over a decade. First, the families with children moved away because the schools thinned out. Then the younger retirees moved because the insurance got unaffordable. Then the older retirees stayed because they could not afford to move. And now, she wrote, the neighborhood is a waiting room. Houses sell when somebody dies. Kids visit in December and spend most of the visit helping their parents figure out whether to get out while they still can. Cynthia's post ended with a sentence that has stayed with me. She wrote, "This is not a community anymore, it is a lease on a memory." Picture this, a Saturday afternoon in a Volusia coastal neighborhood. The streets are quiet. 2 or 3 houses have estate sale signs on the lawn. A realtor is putting a for sale sign in a yard where the lawn is already overgrown. Down the block, a woman in her late 60s is sitting on her porch with a calculator and an insurance renewal letter, doing the arithmetic one more time as if the numbers will have moved. They have not moved. They never do. Volusia is number 5 because it is what happens when a place stops being destination and starts being exit. It is not dramatic. It is not telegenic. It is the slow, quiet, unfilmed version of the story, which is exactly why most of the country has never heard of it, and exactly why most of the country is about to be living it. Number 4. Hillsborough County, the Tampa Mirage. Hillsborough County is Tampa. Tampa, if you have been reading any business publication in the last 4 years, is supposed to be the success story. The city that figured it out. The city that attracted financial firms from New York, tech workers from San Francisco, young families from the Midwest. The city with a waterfront that got reinvented, a downtown that got vertical, a sports franchise that won championships, and a mayor who appeared on national television saying that Tampa was the city of the 21st century. Tampa is the counterpoint that Florida boosters point to when you bring up Miami. See, they say, not every coastal city is failing. Look at Tampa. I want to tell you why Tampa is on this list at number 4, and why, if you understand Tampa, you understand what the next 8 years act to still collapse. And it has a Gulf Coast position that so far has not taken a direct major hurricane hit in the way that Southwest Florida has. These 3 conditions have given Tampa a window, but all 3 of them are temporary, and the Tampa city planners know it. I have read their internal documents. The Tampa Bay region, according to a recently updated federal climate projection, has one of the highest expected storm surge exposures in the entire Gulf of Mexico basin. The bay itself acts as a funnel. A direct strike from a major hurricane on the wrong trajectory would push surge 10 to 15 feet into downtown Tampa. The city's flood infrastructure is, in the planner's own words, unprepared for a direct strike of that magnitude. Tampa has not taken a direct major strike in over 100 years. That is not a safety record, that is statistical luck. And the insurance industry, which has been writing Tampa Bay policies at relatively normal rates, is beginning to quietly reprice. The commercial real estate underwriters have already repriced. Tampa office building insurance premiums for waterfront and near-water properties rose 47% in the last 2 years. Residential is lagging, but lagging is not avoiding. Lagging is waiting. The property tax situation in Hillsborough is also worth understanding. Tampa's housing boom from 2020 through 2023 drove assessed values up at rates that are almost unprecedented. A home bought for $300,000 in 2020 was appraised at $570,000 by 2024. The property tax on that home, even with homestead caps, rose substantially. For owners who have lived in the house for many years, the homestead exemption provides some protection. For owners who bought during the boom, the full reassessed burden hits them directly. The median new buyer in Hillsborough now pays over $7,000 a year in property tax, up from $3,200 just 5 years ago. Add insurance, which in the most vulnerable parts of the county now averages $5,800, and you are looking at $12,000 to $13,000 a year in carrying costs before the mortgage payment. That is the equivalent of a second mortgage applied to a house that already has one. A Reddit user named Kevin DeStefano, who bought a South Tampa bungalow in 2021, posted a detailed breakdown of his monthly housing expenses in 2025. Mortgage, $2,600. Property tax escrow, $620. Homeowners insurance, $610. Flood insurance, $290. HOA, $60. Total monthly, $4,180. His monthly income after tax is $6,800, which means his housing expense is 61% of his take-home pay. He wrote that he cannot sell because the market in his neighborhood has softened and he would take a loss. He cannot refinance because rates are higher now than when he bought. And he cannot reduce his carrying costs because the insurance and property tax are both moving in the wrong direction. His post ended with a question: when does this stop being a house and start being a job? The top comment said, "It already did, you just have not admitted it yet." Picture this: a Friday evening in South Tampa. The bars are full, the restaurants have waits, the new condo towers downtown are lit up against the sky. Young professionals are walking to dinner. The Tampa that shows up in magazine profiles is real. It exists. It is also sitting on a timer that nobody is willing to look at. The next major storm that takes the wrong path turns Tampa from success story to cautionary tale in 48 hours. And the reason Tampa is number 4 and not higher on this list is not that the risk is lower. It is that the risk has not yet been acknowledged, which makes Tampa the most dangerous kind of county. The kind where the problem is fully loaded and the trigger has not yet been pulled. Number 3, Monroe County, the archipelago retreat. Monroe County is the Florida Keys, 120 miles of islands strung off the southern tip of the mainland like a sentence extending past its period. Population 82,000, give or take. Monroe is the smallest county in this finale by population, and it is also the most exposed. Every single square mile of Monroe County is within 10 miles of the ocean. Most of it is within a few hundred feet. The average elevation of the inhabited Keys is under 5 feet. When you fly into Marathon or Key West, the plane descends over water that, from the air, looks indistinguishable from the runway until the wheels touch down, because the runway is, functionally, at sea level. What is happening in Monroe County right now is different from anything happening in the other 9 counties on this list. Monroe is not debating whether to adapt. Monroe has already decided that, for certain communities within the county, adaptation is not possible. The Monroe County government, over the last 3 years, has produced a series of planning documents that, in official bureaucratic language, lay out the concept of managed retreat. Managed retreat is the idea that some inhabited areas are going to be abandoned, with government coordination, because the cost of keeping them habitable exceeds the cost of relocating their residents. You will not hear the phrase managed retreat in political speeches, because no politician wants to say it out loud. But it is in the engineering reports, it is in the long-term capital planning documents, and it is beginning to show up in the grant applications to federal agencies. Here is the specific data. Monroe County has, within its jurisdiction, approximately 311 miles of roadways. Of those, the county engineers have identified about 150 miles that, under current sea level rise projections, will require either elevation or abandonment by 2040. Elevation, meaning physically raising the road surface by 3 to 6 feet, costs between $7 and $11 million per mile. Do the arithmetic. 150 miles times $9 million per mile is $1.35 billion. Monroe County's annual operating budget is around $200 million. The federal government has historically covered a substantial portion of storm recovery, but has not committed to the kind of preemptive infrastructure elevation that Monroe's planners are now modeling. Which means Monroe is looking at a gap of roughly $1 billion between what its infrastructure needs to survive and what its revenue base can possibly generate. The insurance market in Monroe has already collapsed. There is effectively no private homeowner market left in most of the Keys. The state insurer of last resort covers the majority of policies at premiums that, on average, now run between 4 and 9% of the home's value per year, meaning a $400,000 home in the Middle Keys pays between $16,000 and $36,000 a year in insurance. On homes where the median owner income is $65,000, that is a mathematically impossible carrying cost for most residents. The only way it works is if the owner is a second home buyer with significant other income, or a retiree with substantial savings, or an investor monetizing through short-term rentals. The workforce residents, the fishermen, the boat captains, the hospitality staff, the teachers, the nurses, are being priced out at an accelerating rate. Monroe's workforce housing crisis is the single most severe in the state, and the county has responded by building subsidized employee housing, which, in a grim kind of poetry, is being built on the same vulnerable elevations as the housing the employees were being priced out of. A Reddit user named Eleanor Ramirez, a longtime Marathon resident whose family has been in the Keys for 3 generations, posted a thread about what she called the last generation. She wrote that her parents raised her in a house 2 blocks from the water, and she could not afford to buy that house today, even if her parents gave her the down payment, because the insurance alone would exceed her entire monthly salary as a schoolteacher. She wrote that she is moving to Homestead on the mainland at the end of the school year. She wrote that her 3 best friends from high school have already left. She wrote, "I am leaving the place that made me, and the place that made me is going to go underwater, and my children will not believe me when I tell them it ever existed the way it did." Picture this, a Tuesday morning in Isla Mirada. The sun is up, the water is turquoise. A few fishing boats are heading out. A realtor is hammering a sign into the lawn of a house that has been on the market for 11 months. A county truck is driving slowly down US 1, pulling over every few hundred feet to take elevation readings with a handheld device. The truck is doing the math on which stretches of road will be raised and which will be left. Nobody in the restaurants and the souvenir shops knows which list they are on. The county has not published the list. It will not publish the list until the funding is secured, and the funding may never be secured, which means the list may never be published, which means some communities will find out which list they are on only when the water decides for them. Monroe is number 3 because it is the only county on this list where the local government has, in writing, begun planning for the controlled abandonment of inhabited land. That is not a forecast, that is a filing cabinet. Number 2. Franklin County. The forgotten Panhandle. Franklin County is on the Gulf Coast, in the Florida Panhandle, almost directly south of the Georgia border. Population just under 12,000. That is not a typo, 12,000. It is one of the smallest counties in Florida by population, and it is also one of the most telling. Because Franklin County is what you get when the federal, state, and private insurance systems all step back from a place at the same time, and nobody in the rest of the country notices because there are not enough voters in Franklin to make the evening news. Here is what is happening in Franklin. The county is built around a string of small Gulf front communities: Apalachicola, East Point, Carabel, St. George Island. These are working-class towns, historically built on oyster harvesting, fishing, and modest beach tourism. The economy here has never been rich. The average household income in Franklin is just over $51,000. The median home price 5 years ago was around $220,000. Today, it is around $310,000, which sounds like growth, but the growth happened almost entirely in second home and vacation rental inventory. The workforce housing inventory did not grow, it shrank, because the same properties that used to be workforce rentals are now short-term rental LLC holdings, monetized through platforms and no longer available to the people who actually staff the restaurants and run the boats. The oyster industry, which was the historic economic backbone of Franklin County, effectively collapsed about a decade ago for a combination of environmental reasons, including salinity changes in Apalachicola Bay, upstream water disputes with Georgia, and ecosystem shifts. The commercial oystering fleet that once numbered in the hundreds is now a handful of boats. The processing houses are closed. The people who worked in them either moved or retrained or aged out. That collapse alone would have been enough to define the county's last decade. But it happened in parallel with the insurance collapse, the tourism shift, and the infrastructure decline, and so Franklin County has been absorbing structural blows on 3 or 4 fronts at the same time, with a tax base too small to respond. The insurance situation in Franklin is, in its own way, worse than what I described in Monroe County, because Monroe at least has the state backstop actively writing policies at high premiums. In Franklin, even the state insurer of last resort is selective. Certain zip codes within the county have been quietly categorized as inadvisable for continued underwriting, meaning the state is willing to write policies but is pricing them in ways that functionally exclude working-class owners. The effective insurance market for a Franklin County oyster fisherman's bungalow is, at this point, almost non-existent. Which means the bungalow cannot be mortgaged, which means it cannot be sold to anyone who needs a mortgage, which means the only buyers are cash, which means the price gets set by the thinnest possible market, which means the owner, if they want to leave, either accepts a steeply discounted offer or stays. The infrastructure situation is severe. Franklin County's main east-west artery, US Highway 98, runs along a stretch of coast that has been progressively armored, rebuilt, and now, in some segments, simply closed during storm events with no timeline for permanent reopening. The State Transportation Department has internal memoranda acknowledging that certain segments of 98 are, in their words, in a state of strategic deferral, which is a phrase that means the department has decided to stop investing in keeping those segments functional and will let them deteriorate until a decision is forced by a storm event. When that decision is forced, the likely outcome is not rebuilding. The likely outcome is rerouting inland, which would strand the coastal communities on a spur, making them accessible only via longer, indirect routes, which would further degrade their economic viability. A Reddit user named Doyle Henriksen, who grew up in Apalachicola and whose father and grandfather were oystermen, posted a thread last year that captured the mood. He wrote that his hometown is quietly dying, not because of any single storm, not because of any single policy, but because 100 small decisions made elsewhere, in insurance boardrooms and state transportation offices and federal grant committees, have compounded into a slow withdrawal of the infrastructure that makes a coastal community possible. He wrote, "My father's generation built this place out of oyster shells and hard work, and my generation is watching it get erased by spreadsheets we are not allowed to see." The comment with the most engagement was from another user who said, "Every small coastal town in America is one spreadsheet away from your town. Remember that." Picture this, a Sunday afternoon in Apalachicola. The main street still has its old Florida charm. historic buildings, a few tourist shops, a coffee place that opened 3 years ago and is, on this Sunday, half full. Walk 1 block toward the water. The shrimp boats that used to line the docks are down to a few. Walk another block. There is a house with plywood over the windows, not from a recent storm, just because the owner left 18 months ago and never came back. The weeds in the yard are waist high. There is a for sale sign that has been there long enough to have faded in the sun. The realtor's phone number on it is still accurate, but she does not expect the phone to ring. Franklin County is number 2 because it is what happens when a place becomes economically invisible. When you are too small to matter to the markets, too poor to defend yourself from the withdrawal, too remote to attract the kind of climate exit money that is flowing into other parts of Florida. Franklin is a preview of every small American coastal community in every small American coastal county, from Texas to North Carolina, that is about to discover it is also too small to matter. And now, number 1, the culmination of this season, Miami-Dade South, where all 3 curves crossed. Miami-Dade South is not a formal jurisdiction. It is a planning district. It covers the southern portion of Miami-Dade County, stretching from roughly the southern edge of the city of Miami down through Cutler Bay, Palmetto Bay, Homestead, Florida City, and the unincorporated southern expanse that runs toward the edges of Everglades National Park and Biscayne Bay. It includes some of the fastest-growing residential neighborhoods of the last decade. It includes some of the most elevationally vulnerable communities in the entire state. And it is the first American county subdivision where the 3 curves I have been describing throughout this entire season have, in measurable terms, crossed simultaneously. Home prices falling, insurance availability vanishing, ocean rising. 3 lines on a graph moving toward each other for 15 years, and in the last 18 months in Miami-Dade South, they met. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers are the story. Median single-family home prices in the Miami-Dade South Planning District peaked in late 2022 at approximately $441,000. By the third quarter of 2025, they had fallen to approximately $378,000. That is a 14% nominal decline, and in real terms, adjusted for inflation, closer to 23%. Insurance availability, measured by the number of distinct carriers willing to write standard homeowner policies in the district, fell from 14 in 2020 to 3 in 2025. Of those 3, 2 are the state insurer and a surplus line specialist with strict elevation requirements that exclude most of the district's housing stock. The effective market is 1 carrier, and that carrier is writing policies at premiums that exceed 8% of home value per year in many zip codes. And the ocean. The mean higher high water line at the Virginia Key tide gauge, which is the primary reference station for the district, has risen approximately 6 inches over the last 15 years, with an accelerating rate over the last 5. 6 inches sounds small. 6 inches at the flat elevations of Miami-Dade South translates into hundreds of additional acres of regular tidal inundation and a statistically significant increase in the frequency of sunny day flooding events, from roughly 4 per year to roughly 22 per year at the most exposed measurement points. 3 curves: falling home prices, vanishing insurance, rising ocean. For 15 years, these 3 lines were moving in their separate directions, tracked by different agencies, published in different reports, understood by different specialists. And in Miami-Dade South, over the last 18 months, they have crossed, which is another way of saying the place has become mathematically incoherent. A house that is losing value, cannot be insured, and is increasingly underwater for a growing number of days per year is not a house in the sense that the American financial system understands houses. It is a depreciating asset with an unfunded liability and an environmental obligation that the owner cannot discharge. The banks know this. The rating agencies know this. The county government, quietly, internally, knows this. And in the most significant policy action of this entire season, the Miami-Dade County government filed, in the third quarter of 2025, a formal request to federal authorities for what it called Community Transition Funding. Community Transition Funding. Read it slowly. Community Transition Funding. It is the first time in American history that a major American county has filed a formal federal request for funding to assist in the voluntary relocation of its residents from portions of its own jurisdiction. This request is sitting on a desk in Washington right now. Almost nobody outside Florida knows it was filed. The coverage, in the few outlets that reported on it, used language like resilience planning and regional adaptation, which are bureaucratic euphemisms for what the request actually is, which is the first official acknowledgement from a local American government that certain portions of its land are no longer viable for continued residential occupation, and that the people living on those portions need help leaving. The request is for approximately $1.9 billion over the next decade, targeted at specific zip codes within Miami-Dade South to support voluntary buyouts, relocation assistance, and the decommissioning of infrastructure in the areas from which residents have been bought out. The federal response, as of the last available update, is under review, which in Washington language means nobody has decided what to do with it, because nobody wants to be the first senator to stand next to a document that acknowledges, publicly, that an American county is asking to be partially abandoned. Let me tell you about the people who live in those zip codes. Because the numbers are the story, but the numbers are not the whole story. There is a family in a neighborhood at the southern edge of the planning district. The name on the mailbox is Delgado. Rosa and Hector Delgado, both in their early 60s, moved into that house in 1994. They raised 2 children in it. They paid off the mortgage in 2017. It was supposed to be their retirement. Their house is in one of the zip codes specifically identified in the county's Community Transition Funding request, which means the county has internally classified their neighborhood as a candidate for managed retreat. The Delgados do not know that. The list has not been published. When I spoke to Rosa on the phone, she told me that her insurance had been non-renewed 8 months ago. She told me that the only policy she could find was through a surplus lines broker at $7,200 a year with a hurricane exclusion above Category 2. She told me that her property tax assessment came back higher, not lower, because the reassessment model does not yet reflect the market decline. She told me that the house she paid off 3 years ago is now a house she cannot afford to keep insured, cannot afford to sell at a price she would accept, and cannot, by any financial logic, pass on to her children the way she had planned for 30 years. She said, and I remember this exactly, "I paid off a house that is disappearing around me." There is another family. The name is Okonkwo. Daniel and Grace Okonkwo, immigrants from Lagos who arrived in the United States in 2003, bought their first American home in Homestead in 2012. They have 3 children, the oldest of whom is now in college. Their house is 2 miles inland from the Biscayne Bay coast. Under older flood maps, they were outside the high-risk flood zone. Under the most recent federal flood maps, published in 2024, they are inside a newly designated moderate risk zone, which changes their insurance requirements and increases their annual costs by approximately $1,900. Daniel works in logistics. Grace is a nurse. Their combined income is healthy by American standards, and they are, right now, doing the calculation that hundreds of thousands of Miami-Dade South families are doing. Do we sell now, at a loss, and take our equity elsewhere while the market still supports a transaction? Do we stay, absorb the rising costs, and hope that the federal relocation request gets funded in time to make us whole? Or do we stay and accept that our house is no longer an asset, it is an expense, and plan our finances around that assumption? There is no right answer. There is no model that tells them what to do. They are flying blind through a policy landscape that their local government has mapped but has not shared. And there is a third person. His name is Terence Whitfield. He is 74 years old. He lives alone in a small concrete block house in a neighborhood his parents moved into in the late 1960s, when the area was one of the few places where black families could buy property. His parents bought that house. They raised him in it. He inherited it. He lives in it. He has lived in Miami-Dade South for 74 years. His insurance was non-renewed in 2024. He cannot find replacement coverage at any premium he can afford on his Social Security income. He is technically in violation of his mortgage, except that he paid off his mortgage in 1993, so there is no bank to enforce anything. He simply lives in his house, uninsured, while the ocean gets closer, while the property taxes go up, while the neighborhood around him gets quieter, while the county government files transition funding requests that he has never heard of. When I asked him what he was going to do, he said, "I am going to stay in my house until the house decides I cannot stay in my house." And then he laughed, not bitterly, but with the kind of laugh that people use when they have made peace with something they did not choose. These are three families: Rosa and Hector Delgado, Daniel and Grace Okonkwo, Terence Whitfield. There are hundreds of thousands more like them in Miami-Dade South alone, and millions more like them up and down the coasts of this country, in zip codes that have not yet made it onto the county transition funding lists, because those lists have not yet been drafted, but will be, soon, in counties you have not yet heard of, in states that have not yet acknowledged the problem. Miami-Dade South is number one because it is not the worst place. It is the first place. It is the first American county subdivision where the mathematical, environmental, and financial curves crossed at the same point, and where the local government responded, for the first time in American history, by asking the federal government to help its people leave. Let me bring this season home. For 19 episodes, I have walked you through states: California leaving itself, Texas running out of water, New York pricing out its own middle class, Michigan balancing on pipes installed before the moon landing, West Virginia watching its retirees outlive its tax base, Illinois, Ohio, Louisiana, Arizona, Colorado, the Carolinas. And in every one of those episodes, there was a moment where the data seemed to point somewhere else, somewhere south, somewhere where the same pressures were operating but compressed harder, faster, more visibly. That somewhere was Florida, and now you know why. Florida is not a state in the ordinary sense for the purposes of this season. Florida is a compression. Florida is where all the trends we covered, across all the states we covered, are running simultaneously, on the same households, at the same time. The exodus trend we saw in California, the insurance trend we saw in Louisiana, the retirement trend we saw in West Virginia, the infrastructure trend we saw in Michigan, the climate trend we saw in Arizona. They are all here, at the same time, in the same county lines. And in Miami-Dade South, they crossed. When I started this season, I told you we were going to try to draw a map of where this country is going. Not where it is going. A map of 2030, built out of the data we have in 2026. I have delivered that map, piece by piece, state by state, trend by trend. And if you have watched every episode, you now have, in your head, a version of that map. You know which states are losing people and which are gaining. You know which regions are over-leveraged on insurance and which are over-leveraged on infrastructure. You know where the retirement crunch hits hardest and where the climate exposure is most severe. You have, without realizing it, been building an intelligence picture of this country that almost no one else in the general public has. And the 10 counties of this finale are your first concrete coordinates on that map. Lee County, where the insurance market evaporated. Collier County, where the wealthy discovered that money is not a solution to geography. Palm Beach, where the sophisticated capital is quietly hedging with high-elevation real estate hundreds of miles away. Broward, where the accountants have specialized in flooding. Miami-Dade North, where vertical construction is being bet against horizontal water. Volusia, the forgotten coast that slowly drains without ever becoming a headline. Hillsborough, the Tampa success story that has not yet met the storm that will redefine it. Monroe, the Keys, where the county government has begun planning for the controlled abandonment of inhabited land. Franklin, the Panhandle county that is economically invisible and therefore disposable. And Miami-Dade South, the first American jurisdiction to formally ask the federal government for relocation money. If you wanted a map of 2030, here it is. It looks like Florida, and the reason it looks like Florida is that Florida got there first. Here is what I want you to do with this information. I do not want you to be afraid. Fear is not a useful emotion in the face of data. I want you to be informed. I want you to look at the coastal county you live in, or the low-elevation county you live in, or the wildfire county you live in, or the drought county you live in, and I want you to ask the three questions. What is happening to insurance availability in my zip code over the last 5 years? What is happening to home prices in my zip code over the last 18 months? And what do the most recent federal flood, fire, or drought maps say about my property? If all three of those lines are moving in the wrong direction, you are in an early version of what Miami-Dade South is in a late version of. You have time, you have options, you have agency. But you only have those things if you ask the questions now, not when the insurance non-renewal letter shows up in your mailbox on a Tuesday morning. This has been Season 1. We covered 20 states. We covered 20 trends. We ended in one state that proved the thesis of the entire season, which is this: America is not collapsing. America is reorganizing. And the reorganization is uneven because geography is uneven, and insurance is uneven, and wealth is uneven, and information is uneven. The people who have the information early are making their moves quietly. The people who get the information late will be making their moves loudly, in the middle of a crisis, with fewer options and lower prices. The purpose of this channel, the purpose of Report State, is to make sure you are in the first group, not the second. Not because we are pessimists, because we are literate. Because we can read the data that the wealth managers and the reinsurance syndicates and the county planners are already reading, and we think you should be reading it too. Season 2 drops next spring. The subject is not states. The subject is industries. Which industry dies first in the reorganization? Which industry reinvents itself and survives? Which industry is already dead and just has not filed the paperwork? We will be covering American oil, American healthcare, American retail, American commercial real estate, American airlines, American banking, and a few others that may surprise you. If you found this season useful, if you found this finale useful, the most valuable thing you can do, for yourself and for the people you care about, is to subscribe. Like this video if you want Season 2. Share it with the one person in your life who still thinks Florida is a vacation brochure. They need this more than they know. I am Report State. This has been Season 1. You just saw 2030. It had a zip code. See you in the spring.